This is Bob Wooley, and I'd like to describe for you the Civil War in Levy County, and especially the skirmish at Number 4 Station. But before we go there, I'd like to show you how the Cedar Keys were important and what military actions occurred around the Cedar Keys leading up to the skirmish in 1865. This is a picture of a wonderful diorama at the Cedar Key State Museum that Chris Caramongo helped me take the picture of. This is the Cedar Keys as seen in an original map from 1854 that's available in the P.K. Young Library in Gainesville. I've outlined the coast and the major islands in green. This shows Way Key, which is the island actually that the city of Cedar Key is on now, and the channel, which is the reason that you might want to put a railroad down here. It's right in front of Way Key. And then finally, there's a couple of islands, Pine Key and Way Key, that sort of lead their way out to Way Key and might facilitate putting a railroad through there. Building a railroad across the state of Florida was a passion of David Levy Wooley, pictured in the upper right. He started developing his ideas as well as putting support together privately and publicly as early as 1854. This map shows the route of the railroad from Fernandina to the Cedar Keys. The railroad was opened all the way to Sumner on January 1st, 1860, leaving the last 6 miles to the Cedar Keys yet to be completed. Born David Levy in St. Thomas in 1810 of Jewish ancestry, he moved to Florida as a child in the 1820s. He's the first Jewish person to serve in the United States Senate from 1845 to 51. From 1855 to 1861. He added Wooley to his name to try and sound less Jewish, and around 1846 he became a Christian. An event occurred on November 6, 1860, that would prove to have serious consequences for the Cedar Keys. Abraham Lincoln was elected as President of the United States, and I should remind you, with 0 votes from Florida and all the southern states, as he wasn't even on the ballot. To say the least, Abraham Lincoln's election was not well received in the South. South Carolina seceded from the Union on December 20th, 1860, followed by Mississippi and then Florida on January 10th, 1861. This is an image of the actual Ordinance of Secession for Florida signed by 62 representatives from around the state on January 10th. This flag, made by the ladies of Broward's Neck in Duval County, was presented to the governor and displayed in the Capitol, where the ordinance was signed. This flag depicts the 3 states that have seceded from the Union to this date, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Florida. There are also 12 additional stars that are hard to see, but they represent the 12 additional states that may join the Confederacy. This flag currently resides in Tallahassee Museum, but is not available for viewing. On March 1st, 1861, Wooley completed the railroad to the wharf on Way Key. That's current Dock Street in the town of Cedar Key. The dock was not like Dock Street is today, but was a wooden wharf that the railroad went out on to the various warehouses and ships. This map, also from P.K. Young Library, dates from 1860 and shows the path of the railroad from Number 4 across Pine Key, now called Haven Isle, and Middle Key, now called Sunset Key, to Way Key. The model of the wharf with a warehouse is in the Cedar Key Historical Society Museum. The photo is most likely post-Civil War, but it shows the dock just as it was with the railroad track on it. To continue with what was happening elsewhere, Lincoln was inaugurated on March 4th, 1861, 3 days after the Florida Railroad opened. An event that rocked the nation and the Cedar Keys. Fort Sumter was attacked and captured by Confederate forces on April 12, 1861. Almost immediately after the surrender of Fort Sumter, the Lincoln administration declared a naval blockade of the South. This had a great impact on the Cedar Keys. No longer could ships freely enter and leave the harbor at Way Key. The Cedar Keys would come under the jurisdiction of what we call the East Gulf Blockading Squadron, headquartered in Key West. This squadron covered the coast from just west of Pensacola to Cape Canaveral and included Nassau, the Bahamas. The Cedar Key Wharf instantly becomes an important harbor for the Confederate blockade runners with its rail connections to the interior of the state and all the way to the north of the Confederacy. While it won't be easy sailing into and out of the Cedar Keys harbor anymore, the direct offload of ships to the railroad makes this a great place for blockade runners to go. This is a photo of another nice diorama at the Cedar Key State Park Museum. Blockade running into and out of the Cedar Keys directly to the wharf on Way Key continued through 1861, generally in schooners like the upper right. By January 1862, the Union was also very concerned about it. A British steamship named the Gibraltar, like the ship in the lower left, that left Nassau loaded with guns and ammunition that they thought might be headed to the Cedar Keys. There was also some privateering going on, and several Union ships were captured by Southerns and brought into the Cedar Keys. In January 1862, Commander Goldsmith of the USS Florida reported that the battery at Seahorse Key may be abandoned and that a small force might be able to destroy the railroad dock, but his ship's draft was too deep and he could not approach the Keys. On January 7, 1862, Commander G.F. Emmons of the USS Hatteras was ordered to the Cedar Keys to destroy the small armed steamer and schooner, but not to remain there for more than 3 or 4 days. The Hatteras, with her low draft, was the only vessel in the squadron that could effectively operate close to the Cedar Keys. On January 16, 1862, the USS Hatteras attacked the Cedar Keys, first landing at Seahorse Key, location of the lighthouse, shown here as it would have appeared in 1862, and spiking 2 18-pounder cannons found there, thus disabling. The cannons shown here appear to be 18-pounders according to the size of the bore, even though a sign nearby says they are 24-pounders. They are currently located at the Cedar Key State Museum. They also destroyed an army barracks and seized artillery ammunition. Cedar Keys Lighthouse, built in 1854 by Lieutenant George Gordon Meade, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, still stands on Seahorse Key. George Gordon Meade, by the way, was the Union commander at Gettysburg during the Civil War. Commander Emmons and the USS Hatteras continued on into the harbor at Way Key and destroyed all the public property there. They destroyed the railroad depot, the wharf, a telegraph station, turpentine storehouse, and 7 railroad cars. They burned 2 schooners loaded with cotton, lumber, turpentine, rosin that were ready to go to sea. 2 other schooners, 3 sloops, a sailboat, launch, a ferry scow, and various supplies. The schooner Fanny escaped. A small Confederate force of a lieutenant and 22 men of the 4th Regiment, Florida Volunteers, were acting as a police force to protect the 80 to 100 inhabitants against marauders. The lieutenant and 14 privates tried to escape from Depot Key, which is now at Sedaodi, on a raft. When they got to the middle of the channel, their poles were too short, and they were left to the mercy of the current and were captured. 4 were released right away because they were very sick with the measles. The rest escaped. The Confederate detachment was criticized for not fighting back, but they did not want to bring the might of the gunboat down on the citizens. It is unclear why they did not have a steamer, as one had been chartered for their use. Why was there such a small force? It was all that could be spared. All Florida troops had been ordered to Fernandina. 2 companies stationed at Cedar Key were sent to Fernandina when Fernandina was not attacked, and having received a petition from the citizens of Cedar Key, a guard force was sent back. The USS Hatteras left as was ordered within a couple of days of the attack on the Cedar Keys. On January 28, 1862, the USS Tahoma was ordered to proceed without delay to enforce a rigid blockade of the Cedar Keys and prevent reoccupation of Seahorse Key by the Confederate forces. In April 1862, the Navy requested troops from the Army to occupy Tampa, Apalachicola, and the Cedar Key. The Army was unable to comply. The Union does not occupy Cedar Key, but continues to blockade the surrounding waters. You can see a list here in yellow of some of the various ships that blockaded the Cedar Keys in 1863 and 1864. And then on the lower left is actually a model that's in the Cedar Key Historical Society Museum of the USS Fort Henry, one of the primary blockading ships during the war off of Cedar Key. Just about a year after the USS Hatteras sacked the Cedar Keys, Captain Semmes and the CSS Alabama, Confederate steam and sail warship that went all over the world sinking Union merchant ships, came upon the Hatteras off Galveston, Texas, and in 15 minutes sank it. All Union sailors not killed in the action were saved from a watery grave by the Alabama and taken to Jamaica. After the fall of Vicksburg in July of 1863, Florida cattle became more important as a supply to the Confederate armies in the field. Union General Gilmore said in March of 1864, "I am convinced that they have drawn 2,000 head of cattle per week from along the Cedar Key Railroad during the past year." In 1862, estimated greater than 600,000 head of cattle were in Florida. An attempt to be more efficient in preventing cattle from being rounded up and driven north from Florida, the Union created the 2nd Florida Cavalry Union and deployed the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops to Florida. The 2nd Florida Cavalry Union, formed in southern Florida, was from Southern Unionists and Confederate deserters. The 2nd U.S. Colored Troops was formed and trained in Philadelphia of contrabands for former Southern slaves and shipped to Louisiana in November of 1863. If you remember, back in January of 1862, when the U.S. Navy sacked the Cedar Keys, they did not occupy the islands. They simply left a gunboat to blockade and try to prevent any blockade runners from running into the Cedar Keys. It wasn't until June of 1864 that the U.S. Army actually occupied the Cedar Keys. As this initial post report shows, there were 5 companies of the 2nd Florida Cavalry and 2 companies of the 2nd Colored Troops stationed there, with a total of a little over 400 available for duty. This number stayed about the same, rising slightly in August and September, when 2 additional companies of the 2nd Florida Cav joined. This is a copy of the first post report turned in by the commander, Edmund Weeks. This is also an original photograph of Major Weeks that we found in the Florida Archives in Tallahassee. Interestingly, in the fall of 1864, Weeks was arrested and sent to Key West for a court-martial. It seems a soldier had tried to kill him, and Weeks shot him in the thigh. Weeks testified that the soldier only died because of the incompetence of the doctor on site. It seems Weeks had studied to be a doctor, so his testimony won him an acquittal. He returned to the Cedar Keys in January of 1865. Major Weeks led 2 operations in July of 1864 inland from the Cedar Keys. First was a small action near Station Number 4. The second roamed inland to Otter Creek and beyond to destroy the railroad bridge at the Waukesasee River and tear up the railroads and bending them for a quarter mile. The Confederates could no longer bring troops to Cedar Keys by railroad. Other than these 2 raids, couldn't find anything along the surrounding coast in July and August. It's probable that the temporary commander, Colonel Townsend, that took over after Weeks went to Key West, had no nerve for these kinds of attacks. This is a breakdown of the about 450 Confederates that Colonel Townsend estimated were in the area of Cedar Keys in early December of 1864, including troops by Captain Lutterlow and others in the surrounding areas. In January of 1865, Colonel Townsend reported that all Confederate troops had left the area to reinforce Hood, who had recently been devastated at Nashville. Before we talk about what the Yankees do, let's talk about what the Confederates that were still here. By late 1863, attacks on the Confederate operations in southern Florida were getting out of control. Several proposed forming a special battalion of soldiers who could collect and drive cattle as well as fight. 1st Battalion Florida Special Cavalry was formed before the April 1864 cattle season, with Major Mutterlin commanding. Another group was formed of Confederate deserters roaming the countryside. Lutterlow was made captain and convinced 20 men to join. Lutterlow was a well-known character in post-war Cedar Key. Captain Dickinson was well known throughout Florida for his raids against Yankee supplies. He was known as the Swamp Fox of the Confederacy because he kept popping up unexpectedly and attacking Yankees. He was based in Waldo, but covered a wide area. The east side of the St. John's River was generally controlled by the Yankees. Dickinson left for a raid on February 2, 1865, crossing the river in a simple raft, shown here, that would only hold 12 men and horses at a time. It took them all night to cross the 1-mile river. On February 9th, he was returning across the river with his loot, captured wagons, etc., when he got word of something happening in the Cedar Keys. A map of northern Florida shows the locations of the U.S. armies down in Cedar Key, as well as the Confederate forces in February of 1865. There were Confederates in Tallahassee. 2nd Florida Cavalry under Dickinson was over near the St. Johns River. The Cal Cavalry was scattered nearby, and the U.S. colored troops and the Florida Cavalry U.S. were located on the Cedar Keys. The Yankees, thinking that all the Confederates had left the area, seemed to come up with a plan to move off Cedar Keys, attack Levyville and Clay Landing, and continue north to perhaps Thomasville and free Yankee prisoners that they felt were in Thomasville. Remember, Colonel Townsend had reported that all of the Confederates had left the area. Clay Landing on the Swanee River was used by blockade runners that could run into the Swanee River, and blockade runners could not cross the bar at the inlet, and therefore they were safe once they got in the river. There were reports of blockade runners coming up to Clay Landing, unloading at facilities and hauling the supplies overland to the railroad, about 20 miles, which was in Bronson at that point. Stories of commissary and government supplies were expected to be there. The actual landing is a little more upriver from this photo, taken from the Clay's Landing in Manatee Springs State Park. The landing looks to have had inlets and docks. Levyville, previously known as Sodom on some maps I found, was the county seat for Levy County. There would be supplies and other contraband there. It is located about 2 miles east of the present-day Chiefland. This is a plan of the town from 1874. All that is left today is the cemetery. We found a few Confederate graves in Levyville Cemetery, 2 gravestones for the same person, one vintage and one new. This man was in the 1st Battalion, Florida Special Cavalry, Major Mutterland's command, original Cal Cavalry. Once the Confederate command got word from Captain Lutterlow, who was camped just off Cedar Key, that the Union forces were coming out from under the protection of their gunboats on Cedar Key, they formulated a plan. Formulated by General Jones, commanding the Florida District and employing Dickinson, 2nd Florida Cavalry, and the 1st Florida Reserves under General Miller. He would send General Miller with about 500 troops and 4 artillery pieces from Tallahassee via railroad to Lake City, and then down overland to intercept the Yankees, and send Captain Dickinson around behind the Yankees to prevent their retreat to the Cedar Keys and the protection of their gunboats. This was an opportunity they didn't normally have because they wouldn't attack the Cedar Keys with the gunboats there. Note the distances: 85 miles from Palatka to Levyville, 118 miles from Tallahassee to Lake City, and 53 miles from Lake City to Levy. On this map of just Levy County, we see the situation on February 8th, 1865. The 2nd Florida Cavalry Union and the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops are leaving the Cedar Keys and the protection of their gunboats. They skirmish with the Cal Cavalry near Yurdy's Farm. 4 of 7 Confederates are captured. Yurdy's Farm is located near Sumner today. Yurdy's Farm is in the vicinity of the Shiloh Cemetery, which is about 6 miles inland and down the road at Sumner. There are 2 graves there from those who owned it during the time of the skirmish, William and Carolyn Yurdy. Sumner is where the gas station and the 2 RV parks are now, shortly before you get to Cedar Key. The situation on February 9th, 1865. Upon his return from the east side of the St. John's River, Dickinson gets word from Lutterlow that the Yankees have crossed to the mainland. He delays his departure from the St. John's because of a report that turned out to be false about the Yankee demonstration on the St. John's. Miller is preparing his troops to leave Tallahassee, and after spending the night at the Yurdes farm, the Union forces continue northward as the Cow Cavalry falls. On February 10th, as this map shows, the 2nd Florida Cavalry U.S. attacks Levyville with the Cow Cavalry harassing their rear. The Federals capture 10 horses, 50 contraband, and a wagon at Levyville. Federals realize that the way to Bronson is a swamp, so they head back to Cedar Key. The 2nd U.S. colored troops surprise the picket at Clay's Landing, but the Confederates all escape across the river. The Yankees destroy a good amount of commissary stores and government supplies stored there. Captain Dickinson, who has orders to get between the Federals and Cedar Keys, leaves Palatka at this time. Miller has left Tallahassee on the railroad, bound for Lake City with his Confederates. Major Weeks has already made the decision on February 11th not to head toward Bronson because the road is mostly a swamp, and he started to head back to Cedar Keys. The 2nd Colored Troops leave Clay's Landing and head back to the Cedar Keys as well. It's not clear if this was the original plan or if the plan was changed from heading north further. At dusk, Dickinson arrives about 5 miles east of Levyville, and General Miller is marching south from Lake City with his troops. On February 12th, the 2nd Florida Cavalry Union and the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops arrive at Station Number 4, just off the Cedar Keys. They've come back with 100 head of cattle, 50 contrabands, 13 horses, 5 prisoners. Major Weeks and the prisoners go on to Depot Key by a boat. The rest of the contraband and the soldiers stay on the shore. Captain Dickinson is in the rear of the Yankees. He couldn't cut them off. He arrives at nightfall about 4 miles east of Station Number 4. The Cow Cavalry harasses and falls back. A little bit more of the militia shows up, and General Miller is marching from Lake City. He's about 50 miles in the rear. The morning of February 13th, 1865, about 7 a.m., the 2nd Florida Union Cavalry, the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops are at Station Number 4 with the cattle and the contraband and the horses and the wagons that they'd captured from the Confederates at Levyville and Clay's Landing. At daylight, Captain Dickinson leads the attack on the Union forces, who is using the railroad embankment as a breastwork. In short order, the Union gives way and Dickinson holds the railroad. The Confederate artillery is shelling at a furious rate. Major Weeks hears the gunfire from Depot Key and returns to find his men flying in all directions, leaves an officer to regroup them. Weeks starts bringing 60 additional men of the 2nd Florida Cavalry across the railroad trestle. Lieutenant Burton of Dickinson's command uses his 12-pounder boat howitzer to shell those coming across the railroad trestle. This period lithograph from a book about Dickinson's escapades shows the Union attempting to cross the trestle and being fired upon by the Confederate artillery. So you can see at the far left of the trestle, coming off what would be now Haven Isle, trying to cross the railroad bridge and help out their comrades. Lieutenant Burton's, the 12-pounder boat howitzer, you can see in the middle foreground there, is firing away. There are open targets on the bridge. Lieutenant Burton is using a 12-pound boat howitzer, probably similar to the one in the picture, firing at the railroad trestle about 300 yards. This cannon shoots a 12-pound solid shot, case, or exploding shell. These are hollow, filled with powder, and in the case shot also with lead balls. A fuse lights when the cannon is fired and then explodes over the enemies, showering them with shrapnel and balls. The third kind of round is a canister, shown here. These are like a giant shotgun. This is what Bruton would have been firing at the trestle. Is very effective against artillery, especially at that range. These are two modern panoramic views of where I think the battle took place. The center view is looking from Haven Isle across to the mainland, which would be the opposite view of the lithograph of above. This would have been the route that the Yankees would have been trying to take across the trestle as they tried to attack the Confederates. The bottom panorama is probably the area where the actual fighting was taking place on the mainland side of the number 4 bridge. This is where station number 4 would have been located. This is the situation later in the morning of February 13th. Confederates running out of ammunition. Dickinson himself is running along the line distributing the last 200 rounds. The artillery fires his last rounds and withdraws. Upon running out of ammunition, Dickinson withdraws about 600 yards. Dickinson reports that the Yankees were fleeing everywhere they can, wading through the water, sometimes succumbing to a watery death. Weeks indicated that they drove the enemy back until they broke and ran. He could have been misinterpreting their withdrawal because they were out of ammunition as to them breaking. Over the night of the 13th and into the morning of the 14th of 1865, the 2nd Florida Cavalry Union and the 2nd U.S. Colored Troops were able to escape station number 4, leaving the cattle, horses, and wagons behind. After being resupplied with ammunition from advancing wagons from the 1st Florida Reserve of Miller, who was marching overland from Lake City, Dickinson returns to number 4 to find the Union soldiers are gone. Dickinson returns the cattle and other materials to their original owners in Levyville and Clay Landing. Dickinson was quite confident that they would have captured them all if the ammo hadn't run out when it did. He claims the Union dead, wounded, and captured was 70, none killed or mortally wounded on the south side, with 5 wounded. Weeks claims 5 killed and 18 wounded on his side and 3 taken prisoners. Claims the Confederates left 2 killed on the field. All indications are that Miller had arrived with probably 500 troops and 4 artillery pieces. The Confederate plan to capture the Yankees off the island was a little too ambitious once the Yankees decided to retreat after attacking Levyville and Clay Landing. Confederates came within a day or less of getting Dickinson's troops all the way from Palatka, over 100 miles, to the Cedar Keys. He almost got there, almost caught the Yankees off the island. And of course, General Miller's troops were coming. About 500 troops were coming from the north, and they were there too, about a day late. So while the Yankees were able to get their troops back onto the islands, they were forced to leave all their contraband behind, and the Confederates were able to return that to its rightful owners from whom the Yankees had stolen it. So Dickinson, on February 16th, returned to their headquarters at Waldo. On the way, they were treated to a scrumptious dinner put on by the matrons of Gainesville. Dickinson is commended by General Jones for gallant service in this battle. I hope you enjoyed this description of the skirmish at number 4. And this goes to show you that there really was a civil war in the Cedar Keys. Not only was the island attacked viciously by Union gunboats at the beginning of the war, and then blockaded throughout the war, and finally occupied and used as a military base for attacks inland to Florida. So with that, I'll leave it with you to look further into the other histories of the Civil War in Florida. Thank you for your attention.